tēnā, kia ora tātou, ko Lorraine Johnston tēnei e tūnei ki te mihi atu ki a koutou, nau mai hara mai, hoki mai, ki wainganui a tātou o te whare pukapuka o Oti Oti. O reira, kia ora tātou. Just before we introduce our wonderful speaker, just like to run through the usual thank yous to Julian Smith, who curated this exhibition, and although I was supposed to help him with about 6 of the cases, all I did was select the books and left him to it to do all the hard work. Malcolm Deans, who as usual did the photography and scanning for the online exhibition, which will go live tomorrow.
It's live now.
It's live now. To Kath McCarthy and Jasmine Taylor, who look after all the mounts for the works in the exhibitions and make sure that they are nice and safe. To Casey Thomas, who did the wonderful graphics work, and once again she's excelled herself with the lovely Pacific blue background to the posters and the wall graphic. And to Elise Stock and Barbara Frame, who helped Julian out with proofreading, and Barbara also gave him a little bit of advice on particularly Andrew Sharp and his contribution to the scholarship around Polynesian exploration. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Jeanette Wekaira, Ngāti Pukenga, Ngāti Tamatera, Ngā Puhi. Jeanette has worked in a wide range of roles within the cultural heritage and education sectors, and has held university teaching and professional roles both in New Zealand and Japan. Recently she co-curated Te Takarangi, which I need to bring a copy of, I forgot, which is a collection of 150 Māori-led non-fiction publications from 1815 to 2017. That was a project between Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga, the Māori Centre of Research Excellence, and Te Akarangi, the Royal Society. Jeanette is currently completing doctoral studies at the University of Otago, and her research aims to explore the potency of taonga held in collecting institutions, the connection between taonga and Māori well-being, and the need for decolonised thinking within and imagining within collecting institutions. In order to explore these research aims, Jeanette is investigating a unique taonga held in the British Museum, the ancestral Māori sail, Te Rā. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jeanette. Please give her a warm welcome.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa. Jeanette Wekaira tōku ingoa, he rea hau no te taitokera me hauraki, ko Ngā Puhi, Ngāti Tamatera me Ngāti Puhi o Kuiwi. Tēnā rā tātou katoa. Thank you, Lorraine, and everybody here for coming along. It's a really cold evening, and there's a lot more people here than I thought was going to be here. That's okay. So just a little bit about myself. As Lorraine mentioned, I'm a full-time PhD student. I left your role at the Hocken Library to go full-time on my PhD, and I've worked in over a number of years in different heritage roles and library roles, and so I had this natural kind of inclination to work with taonga, which stems from having been a 16-year-old and visiting the Te Māori exhibition on a school trip, and that sparked something in me where I wanted to, at the end of that day, I made a decision that if this is how taonga Māori made you feel, this is what I wanted to do for a job. I had no idea how I was going to do that. No one in my family had been to university, so it was a big call. But I got there, and I eventually went to Auckland University and studied and did a master's and did postgraduate study in museum studies, and have done a lot of different things. Anyway, I find myself now finishing this PhD, and through a number of different avenues, I've come to Te Rā, the Māori sail that's located in the British Museum. Lots of different people have crossed my path with Te Rā, the latest being Kahutoi Te Kanawa, who I know visited you today, who has told me that she is coming on board as my external PhD supervisor, and I had no choice in that. So, which is another, another wonderful. It's another wonderful gift, I believe, from the ancestors who bring the right people into my path and move other people out of my path. So anyway, it's another story which so I'm going to talk. I brought this along today. This was put together for another presentation that I did as a poster presentation, and come and have a look at it. It sort of talks a little bit more broadly about the PhD. And today I'm really going to talk about some of the early European resources that I have used for part of the PhD. So here we go. Taonga, ancestral treasures from Aotearoa are linked through ancestral ties to the Pacific Islands, spread across a vast expanse of ocean that takes up over a third of the globe. The outstanding mobility of Pacific peoples over the course of several thousand years was a catalyst for the flourishing of an almost kaleidoscopic range of cultures and art traditions, some 20,000 islands and close to 1,800 different cultures and language groups, all of whom share common ancestry. The interconnectedness of the Pacific and its people, wrought from many centuries of dynamic engagement, is a strand that unites all taonga of the region. Storytelling is another great connector, for broadly speaking, all taonga are vital means to access story. Thus, taonga have always been used as a vehicle to channel knowledge, ideas, and ancestral connections. Acting as a mnemonic to memory when activated with cultural practice, it is a crucial conduit for current generations to pass important knowledge from the past into the future. Connecting the sky and ocean, sails provided the means by which our Pacific ancestors traversed Te Moananui-a-Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean. Held in the British Museum collection is a unique and intriguing taonga. Te Rā is the only known traditional Māori sail of its kind in existence today. Although Te Rā was closely studied by early ethnographers, its cultural context has largely been overlooked. My PhD research seeks to revitalise and reclaim Te Rā's cultural knowledge by understanding her from within a Māori worldview. I do this by contextualising Te Rā more broadly within a Māori weaving philosophy that supports our understanding of Māori sails. This knowledge can be found in the whakapapa, genealogical ordering, the tupuna, ancestral links to the spiritual world, the pūrākau, oral histories, the waiata, songs, whakatauki, proverbs, and ngā kōrero iwi, tribal histories. However, this evening I'm going to share one particular aspect of my research where I've drawn from the rich collections of the early European explorers in the Pacific. So, in the 16th and 17th centuries, waka were counted among the curiosities of the Pacific by early European explorers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, waka had become objects of classification. Wallace, aboard the Dolphin in 1767, was the first to describe waka in any detail. He distinguished three different sorts: outrigger dugouts, used chiefly for fishing; larger plank-built waka, either outrigger or double-hulled for voyaging, far beyond the sight of land, as well as large paddling waka intended principally for pleasure and show. Those are Wallace's words. But the big question was summarised by Cook. How shall we account for this nation, he's talking about Tahiti, spreading itself so far across the vast ocean? European visual depictions and written observations of waka were, at least in part, directed at explaining the migrations of the Pacific people across the Moananui-a-Kiwa. These early European records are now the oldest written sources for reconstructing knowledge of waka and sails. The most comprehensive reference book by Haddon and Hornell in 1975 compiled much of their information from primary sources such as the European illustrations and voyage accounts. Linnaea Thompson and the late Suhikinuku Mai Busby both talk of consulting the early European images and observations of Waka Haurua, as well as taonga held in museums, when they first embarked on reigniting their knowledge for building the sea voyaging Waka Haurua, Ukulea and Te Orere. So it was the Spanish who were the first, or were the earliest European explorers in the Pacific. In 1520, a Spanish expedition led by the Portuguese navigator, I might have the right name, I don't quite know to say his name, I think it's Magellan? Does anyone know it? Magellan, thank you. The Portuguese navigator Magellan was the first known crossing of the Pacific Ocean. Magellan sighted only 2 uninhabited atolls before eventually reaching the Marianas, which he first named the island of Latin Sails after the numerous sails he saw there. In 1568, Spanish navigator Mendana had a similar experience. Mendana crossed the South Pacific without encountering any islands in Polynesia at all. For the first part of his trip, he retraced the route of Magellan and passed between the Tukilo and Marquesas archipelago without sighting either of them. However, he continued west and eventually reached the Solomon Islands in the heart of Melanesia. And in the the 1700s onwards, other European powers sent expeditions into the Pacific, namely Holland, England and France. And it's these explorers who reached Aotearoa and who have been the focus of my research, or the focus of a part of my research. So one interesting early encounter by a Dutch explorer in 1616 I'm going to recount, although he didn't get to Aotearoa, but it's an interesting account. So in 1616, William Shelton and Jacob Lemaire, Dutch explorers, encountered an oceanic voyaging waka in the open sea to the north of near Toputapu, between Tonga and Samoa. And an engraving of this vessel was published in 1619 in Shelton's account of the voyage and represents the earliest European graphic rendering of a double-hulled voyaging waka. So this is a waka. They encounter it in the middle of the ocean. It's a big voyaging waka, and it's an incredible encounter. So the engraving of the waka by these Dutch explorers identifies the waka as a double-hulled, eventually would become known as a tungiaki, which is a Latin-sailed Tongan voyaging waka. And in the following passage is the first recorded account of an encounter at sea between a European sailing ship and a Polynesian voyaging waka on May the 18th in 1616. At noon, immediately after dinner, we saw a sail, which we took to be a bark, coming out of the south and running to the north of us. We at once headed for her, and when she got close to us, we fired a shot from our bows over her starboard to get her to haul down, but she would not do it. When we approached her, and before our men boarded her, some of her crew sprang overboard from fright, amongst others. There was one with an infant. In the vessel were some 8 women and 3 young children still at the breast, as well as some who were perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Their vessel was in the shape, as depicted in the drawing, was wonderful to behold. It consisted of 2 long, handsome canoes, which were in a very good, which were a fairly good space, on each supporting a rod with a mizzen sail. This was of matting, and from whatever quarter the wind blew, they were nearly always ready to sail. They had no compasses or any nautical instruments. Their ropes were of bright colours and as thick as a cable, made of such material as fish baskets in Spain. It's an incredible account. From this account, it's recorded that the waka was fired upon by the Dutch ship, and an armed boat was launched to pursue the waka. Musket shots were fired, and several aboard the waka were killed. The waka was boarded by the Dutch, who record that the voyaging waka held at least 25 men, women and children on board. It's an account that I'd never ever heard of, and it was incredible to me to read that and to see the engraving, because in all the literature over the years about voyaging waka and who were on waka, and where they were travelling to. Here's one of the earliest European voyaging ships encounter a double-hulled waka with women and children on it in the middle of nowhere. So, it was always in the accounts, and yet here we have all this kind of toing and froing between academics about what happened and how on earth did they get from one island to another. And then in 1616, there's a Dutch account of, well, this is the reality. They did it. So I love that. I love that little bit of history. So I move on to Tasman. We all know Tasman, but just a brief, in terms of my research, so these encounters recorded in early European observations provide a really rich source of material through which to understand the Pacific world and the Māori world, especially the Māori world when Tasman and then Cook encountered Aotearoa in the 16th and 17th centuries. Such observations provide valuable historical context into the evolution of Māori waka and sails over time. When Tasman first encountered Māori in 1642, double-hulled waka that utilised a sail was still in common use. Tasman's journal entry on December 19, 1642 observes Māori at Moho or Golden Bay and states that their boats consisted of two long, narrow prows side by side, over which a number of planks or other seats were placed in such a way that those above can look through to the water underneath the vessels. Their paddles are upward of a fathom in length, narrow and pointed at the end. With these vessels they could make considerable speed. So he's talking about double-hulled waka and that are up in Tasman Bay. And the Dutch artist Isaac Gilsmans, who's on board the Zeehan Tasman's ship, drew images of these double-hulled waka that they encountered, and many of them have sails. Some of those pictures are here. But 127 years later, in 1769, when Cook arrives in New Zealand, the double-hulled waka was rapidly transitioning to the single-hulled wakatawa, the war canoe that we know now. So it's yet unknown when Te Rā was acquired by the British Museum. I say acquired. The limited provenance available currently suggests that Te Rā was likely acquired by Cook. During Cook's 3 voyages to New Zealand, those on the Endeavour and Resolution received a number of prestige items that were clearly regarded as highly valued taonga by those who gave them, in addition to items they traded for or simply took. Though it's not easy to link these taonga, such as Te Rā, conclusively with particular transactions reported in the voyage journals, detailed accounts of exchanges involving similar prestigious items recorded by the Europeans on Cook's voyages established that valuable taonga played important roles in the dynamics of exchange during Cook's voyages, sometimes being gifted in ceremonial acts of reciprocity that extended over several days. For Māori at Uawa, on the east coast of New Zealand during Cook's first voyage to New Zealand in 1769, the usual European trade goods and trinkets that had been prepared for exchange by the Europeans on board the Endeavour were overlooked by locals for large sheets of tapa that they had recently acquired in Tahiti. So this account from James Cook's journal on October 29, 1769 says, "During our stay in this bay," referring to Uawa, we had every day more or less traffic with the natives, they bringing us fish and now and then a few sweet potatoes and several trifles which we deemed curiosities. For these we gave them cloth, beads, nails. The cloth we got at King George's Island in Rangiatia, well, he spells it Uliatia, but it's Rangiatia in Tahiti. They valued this more than anything we could give them, and as everyone in the ship were provided with some of this sort of cloth, I suffered everybody to purchase whatever they pleased without limitation, for by this means I knew that the natives would not only sell, but get a good price for everything they bought. This I thought would induce them to bring to market whatever they could afford. So here we're seeing that Māori at Uawa weren't interested in nails, they weren't interested in anything, they were interested in the Pacific cloth that Cook had brought with him from Tahiti. They were more interested in that than anything else. And as Anne Salmon suggests, Māori interacted with the navigator explorers Tupaia and Cook, drawing on existing narratives of connection and exchange with the broader Pacific. In this way, a singular encounter and exchange, as I've just described, can be seen to represent a certain acknowledgement by Māori of their Pacific whakapapa at the time of Cook's voyages, when Te Rā was likely acquired. So this kind of idea, I guess, it talks to Māori knew, may have, and I believe knew that this cloth was from Tahiti and they wanted this, and they were reconnecting with a whakapapa that they hadn't yet forgotten through Tupaia and through this Tahitian cloth that they wanted, that Cook had. So during Cook's first voyage to New Zealand in 1769 and 1770, the absence of double-hulled sailing waka was noted. So they didn't see, they'd come from Tahiti, and by the time they got to New Zealand, in Tahiti they'd seen double-hulled waka everywhere with sails, that it had become something that they'd gotten used to seeing. By the time they came to New Zealand, it's noted in the voyaging accounts that they hardly see any waka with sails. There's only one observation in the records of that first trip, and that observation is of a double-hulled waka with a sail off the coast of Whakatane in the North Island. And Banks notes that at 7 I was close under the first, from which a large double canoe, or rather two canoes, lashed together at a distance of about a foot and covered with boards so as to make a deck, put off and made sail for the ship. This was the first vessel of the kind that we had seen since we left the South Sea Islands. When she came near, the people on board entered very freely into conversation with Tupaia, and we thought showed a friendly disposition towards him. But when it was just dark, they ran their canoe close to the ship's side and threw a volley of stones, after which they paddled ashore. So that's the only real account of a double-hulled waka with a sail that is recorded by Cook and others on that first voyage. And a few others talk about this, a few others on board talk about this incident. So I won't go into more of that. So these rich moments and images from history continue to speak of this shared experience of complex and awe-inspiring ocean journeys by Pacific people and European people over the previous centuries in an unparalleled, for Polynesians, an unparalleled feat of navigation, exploration and curiosity. I'm not going to go read that. So, I guess the design and construction of sails have shared many points of similarity across Polynesia, a cultural geographic region covering the eastern and central Pacific, from Hawaii in the north to Rapa Nui East Island in the east and across to New Zealand in the south. Over the past 30 years, there's been a revitalisation and reconstructing ancient Polynesian voyaging waka and Pacific navigational methods, relying on information drawn from contemporary and traditional building and navigational knowledge, historical accounts and drawings. However, very little is still known about ancient fibre sails because they disappeared, as I've shown, very soon after the first contact with Europeans. And in New Zealand, they were already on their way, they were already transitioning out of use by the time Cook arrived. The early European voyages into the Pacific actively collected canoes and sails from the Pacific, which were then taken mostly to Britain and France from the 18th century onwards. The result being that one of the richest collections of Polynesian voyaging technology is now held both in Britain and France, with both of these nations sending exploratory voyages into the Pacific from the Cook voyages onwards. What is known about Te Rā has been described by ethnologists in the early and 20th centuries. So from that point on, there's very little known about Te Rā. I'm aware that there's a lot more, especially since the Tuia 250, happening around Te Rā. There's a number of different groups who are looking at Te Rā. and that is a very good thing. I think the groups that I've been in touch with are doing slightly different projects, and I think one is a very community-led project in the north. It's a group of weavers who are looking to replicate te rā, and I've met with them, and they have recently had a beautiful exhibition of their, I guess it's how te rā has inspired them, and they had a beautiful weaving exhibition of various kind of inspirational pieces. And then there's another te rā project that's out of the University of Otago, and they're looking at similar and different things. That's probably a more academic project, and both, everybody's doing some great work on te rā. My work on te rā comes from a slightly different place. I'm looking at te rā's whakapapa mostly, and some part of building up that whakapapa of te rā has been to go back to the images, and the visual images that Europeans rendered, I guess. And so I've gone back through all the early European explorers to look at the images of waka and the images of sails. The other areas, and that's some of that work, the other areas that I've looked at is more from Indigenous perspective of what kind of knowledge we have around sails and waka. And I've gone back to different, Tapa Whenua is one, the sort of stories and history around kupe arriving in New Zealand. There's lots of stories that different iwi have around the arrival of waka, the building of waka, the use of sails, and I've also looked at toi kohatu or rock art across Polynesia, mostly in Tahiti, Hawaii and New Zealand, and looking at the various depictions of waka and sails, and that's been a really interesting journey as well. So it's a big project about piecing together all the different elements that help to make te rā whole. And I'm not a weaver, so I am looking at it in a different way, but it's been so far a great journey. I'm nearly 2/3 of the way through. So kia ora everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you, Lorraine, for inviting me to come and speak today. Te rā puke kura, ka piri hau I te moana, I reira ka puta maina, te tui mata I Hawaii ki, meke te kola o tau kai puke, ka kopa tia te manu haia. Te rā puke kura, te mauka tapu e.
Just like to say that Kura the Waiata tells the story of those ocean going, tells the story of one of those ocean-going waka, the big sailing waka, traversing Te Moanui-a-Kiwa and getting a rip in the sail. And so they pulled in out here at Pukekura, which you may know as Taiwan Heads, and stayed there for a while they mended their sail and then headed on their way, which is why we chose this way to support you.